We're doing top 10 teachings of the Daf on Daf Chaf Daled, page 24 of Brachos. The first teaching is about when we have a debate between a earlier and a later generation. Who do we follow? Most people would think, for example, if you had a debate between a Mishnah, Brisa, versus an Amora, the earlier rabbinic sages versus a sage in a later period of the Gemara that came after the Mishnah and Brisos, we would follow the Mishnah and the Brisa, but that's actually usually not the case. In theory, it is, but it isn't actually. There's a concept which says hilchasa kebasra. The law is like the later generations, particularly the people who are meant to kind of close out the Talmud, I guess Ravina, Ravashi, when they say something that's authoritative, even if it contradicts a Mishnah or a Brisa. However, we do find an opposing concept, which is that an Amora is not allowed to argue with a Tana. And whenever they do, we try to reconcile them in some way. So, well, which one is it? And the answer is, generally speaking, we defer to the earlier time. But if there's a reason, either perhaps the custom was not practiced, or there's something developed that would change the law or the enactment, then we might actually follow a later authority. And I'm going to give you one example in the beginning of Daf Chaf Daled. It actually technically begins on the end of Chaf Gimel Amud Beis. And here's the case. What we're talking about is in ancient times, a lot of people had issues with safety, security of their private objects, such as the tefillin, which we're talking about. And even more than that, even in the privacy of their own home, there were rodents, mice, and other creatures that would often nibble at just about anything that they could get their little hungry mouths on, including people's tefillin. That would mean that basically, unless you had, I don't know, some like a lockbox to put it in, or a very secure bag to put it in that was mouse-proof, many people who didn't have those things would often simply put the tefillin as close to their person as possible, as to make sure that the rodents would not get to them. However, and says the following. It says that Shmuel says that you're allowed to put the tefillin, you wrap it up, you put it kind of between your bedpost and your pillow, but not directly underneath your head, something to that effect. And the Gemara says, it brings a brisa on the bottom of Chav Gimel Amud Beis that says, well, meisvei contradiction, lo yaniach adam tefillah tachas mergalos b'nei shenag b'hem derech eretz derech b'zayin, aber menichan tachas mershos v'im haisa ishto imo aser. Oh, my apologies. The brisa doesn't say that you're forbidden to put the tefillin in that place. It's if you're alone, but it does forbid it if you're with your wife. Shmuel, on the other hand, permits you to be with your wife, even intimate with your wife, while the tefillin is wrapped up in close proximity to where your head is, but just not underneath where your head is. So it's a contradiction between the Brisa and Shmuel. And the Gemara, in fact, says this is a refutation of Shmuel, right? So the Gemara says, Tiyufta de Shmuel Tiyufta, which literally means Shmuel's opinion is invalidated, which I would then think means that you could not be with your wife when you have your tefillin or in your bed area, even if it's not exactly underneath you, because that's the case. The Gemara actually proceeds to say that that's don't think that. Rava, Amar Rava, Afagaf Tanya to Yufta, even though we learned a brisa that contradicts Shmuel, and I would think that his opinion is invalidated. The Shmuel, Hilchasa Kavasei. Nevertheless, the law is like Shmuel. One can put their tefillin in that place and have their wife with them in bed, even if they're intimate with their wife. My taima, what's the reason why we follow Shmuel? Kol linitiruhu tfei adif. Whatever level of guardianship, protectionism, so to speak, of the safety of the tefillin not being eaten by the mice, as we talked about before, is better. In other words, we follow the Amora, Rava and Amora, rules like Shmuel and Amora, over a brisa of Tanaim, because there's a reason. The commentaries say that perhaps there are other brisas when it talks about changes in laws in the time of the Tanaim, in terms of an outhouse and the tefillin, and moving it more towards holding on to tefillin, even in places that are inappropriate for the sake of safety. We learned about that in the other blot, in the previous blot. Therefore, you can see that there's certain underlying principles that are more important than the psak of the actual ruling of the earlier generations. We follow the principle rather than the rule. That means in halacha, sometimes we will adopt the later rulings because they have a reason, a very good reason to do it. So again, there's a lot to discuss in halachic, the practice of halacha, but many times we do follow later generations, particularly when they give their reason and it makes sense. Okay, that's number one. Obviously, when we talk about following rules of later generations instead of the earlier generations, that is really a sheer in and of itself. And I'm going to continue to include more and more about the halachic process in these shiurim, and maybe one day we'll have an exclusive shiur or more on understanding how halachic process works, because that's an amazing, fascinating subject, and I'd be happy to learn that more in depth with you. And we're going to do a little bit more on today's daf and some of the other top 10 in terms of understanding some things about the halachic process. Number 2 is connected to this idea of halachic process, and it's about learning from books versus learning from practice. Meaning, who do we look at? Do we look at what our Rebbis and fathers and mothers do? Do we look at the practice, the customs of those Rebbeim that we respect, the communities that we're from? Or do we look at Sfarim? Do we look at principles and books? Sometimes I find that some people are book obsessed. They find things in books, and they I don't want to call them chumras, but they are often chumras compared to what their own parents, observant parents, sometimes quite observant, have kept. And is that overly respecting the written word? And what's the place of the tradition, the minhagim that you come from? That's part of this discussion. The other part of this discussion, which is very much related to this idea, number 2, is this idea that the Talmud, most notably in a section in, I think it's Baba Basra 130, talks about a conversation about what exactly is halacha lemaseh. What's the most appropriate way of ascertaining what the halacha is? Is it from following a ruling, often a written principled ruling, or at least in today's day and age, it would be a written principled ruling, like a theoretical ruling that is here's what the law is, or is it something we actually go and see what a rabbi ruled in a case that came before him? In other words, is it theoretical versus actual. And each one has, according to different rabbis, an advantage over the other. So, for example, when we're talking about the theoretical written ruling versus the practical applied ruling, what would be the advantage of the theoretical ruling? You could study it and understand it in and of itself. When it comes to the applied ruling, it isn't so much a written word, it's a contact sport. Often in an applied ruling, the disadvantage is you may not know all the factors. Perhaps there's something the judge knows. Let's say it's a court case that he's adjudicating, and you hear what you think is the main taina, the main issue at hand, but there may be other factors. So you may not know all the factors, and you might misunderstand the rule, as opposed to something that's a theoretical rule. Here is what it is. Apply, does it apply or it doesn't apply? There's more to work with in terms of understanding. On the other hand, anytime a rule is just a theory, we don't really know its application. We don't know if there's two types of Torah. One Torah is the study of Torah, and the other Torah is the practice of Torah. They are not always the same. Anyway, so that's the questions that are raised around number 2. Let's take a look at the Gemara, and our Gemara, to see a little bit about that. So the Gemara says the following. Omer Rav Hamnunas. Rav Hamnunas says, Zimnacha dehava ka'amina kamei Rava. V'amar li zil aisi li tefillin. I was with my teacher, Rava. By the way, Rava was the one who ruled in accordance with Shmuel that you're allowed to have your tefillin in your bed area wrapped up between your pillow and your headboard, just not right underneath your head, even when your wife is with you, meaning you're intimate with your wife, which we said is somewhat controversial because it contradicts a brisa, and Rava follows Shmuel rather than the brisa. That was number 1, right? So here's the story. Rav Hamnunas says, my Rebbi, my teacher Rava, called me and he said, Amar li zil aisi li tefillin. Go and get my tefillin. I guess they were in the base of Medrash, and he said, go to my house, get my tefillin. And I went to his house. I said, where's his tefillin? And they pointed me in the direction, or I just found them. I found it exactly in the place we were talking about, between the pillow and the headboard, but not right underneath his head. V'hava yadaina diyom tefila hava. And I had known that this was the day that I guess the night before, that his wife had gone to the mikvah. In other words, he knew that his well, I don't know how they knew that, but he did for some reason. So v'la'agamirun halacha lemaseh hu de'avid. What his Rebbi was doing, what Rava was doing, is he was teaching Rav Hamnunas the actual applied halacha. That when he ruled in favor of Shmuel that you could do this, it wasn't a theoretical ruling, it was a practical ruling. Look, I'm actually doing it. So that leads me to tell you that the absolute best halacha lemaseh, the absolute best, is when you have both a ruling, a stated rule, or in today's day and age, it's often in writing, in theory, and then you look and see what the custom is. If the custom is to actually do as the rule, then that rule is halacha lemaseh. That rule isn't just a theoretical rule, but it's halacha lemaseh. I heard on one of the YU online shiurim, I think Rabbi Rosner mentioned that there was a time when Rabbi Soloveitchik gave a shir, used to give a shir in honor of his father's yahrzeit, and the shir was an intricate conversation about whether you should sit or stand for Havdalah. And the ending of the shir, the conclusion was that the halacha is you should sit. And then people actually came over to him afterwards and said, is that what we should do? Should we actually sit? Because we're used to standing. He said, listen, In theory, the halacha is to sit, but in practice, the halacha is for most people to stand. So go even though it was supposedly what is the halacha about sitting or standing in during Havdalah, that was the theoretical halacha. The practical halacha, meaning what is the actual hanhaga, what's the actual custom? The custom is to stand for the most part. So, in other words, just because you actually use the word halacha, it doesn't always mean the practice of halacha. Halacha lemaseh means the practice of halacha. Halacha lemaseh means what do we actually do with the halacha, rather what's the theoretical halacha. So again, this teaching and other teachings in the Gemara tell us of the importance that it's not just about what is the halacha in a theoretical model, but it needs to be wedded together with halacha lemaseh, which means the practice. Now, sometimes you have hanhagot, practices that contradict the theoretical halacha. A famous case like this is with the Vilna Gaon. Why is it, for example, that in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel, we only have the Kohanim do the priestly blessing on the holidays? Why don't they do it the rest of the year? Now, the truth is there isn't a very strong reason. There's a weak reason, but there's not a strong reason. So they say that the Vilna Gaon said, our custom is against the halacha, and he reinstituted the Birchas Kohanim, not just on Yom Tov, but the rest of the year as well. And according to the story, something bad happened in Vilna, and he understood that he wasn't supposed to reinstitute the halacha, but rather go with the custom. So sometimes you don't just say, let me look in the Shulchan Aruch, let me look in the Gemara, let me figure out in the theoretical model what the halacha should be. That doesn't actually work all the time. You have to go and see what the actual practice is. This is very important for rabbis. Many rabbis are learning day and night in the yeshivas, but they also have to make sure to not just learn what the book says, but to follow customs and practices which are sometimes greater than what's actually written in the book. Oftentimes but not always. And that's part of what we're doing right here, and what people are doing. Serious students of Torah are looking both in the theoretical model and in the practice model, and that combination is what we call halacha lemaseh, the actual applied halacha. Number 3, and by the way, there is a debate going back to the Talmudic times about, like I said, theoretical versus applied halacha. Which one is applied, meaning actual, like din Torah. They see how the Rebbi paskin in an actual, like, education, which each one, as I mentioned, has an advantage over the other. There's already a debate in the times of the Talmud. That debate still continues between the kind of rabbis who want to base most of their understanding and ruling of law on books versus other rabbis who are experts at particular customs and want to actually now write down codify those customs. In fact, arguably the Ramah, the halachic authority for the Ashkenazim, that could be seen as a big debate between the Sephardic poskim and the Ashkenazic poskim, where the Sephardic poskim, starting from Maimonides, actually even earlier, but definitely clearly in Maimonides, and then clearly in the Beis Yosef and the Mechaber, versus the Ashkenazic authorities that the Ramah often codifies in his glosses to the Shulchan Aruch, are really arguing about this issue that we're talking about. The Maimonidean way, the Rambam, and the Sephardic way that's codified by the Mechaber and the Shulchan Aruch tend to go by what the law is, and the Ashkenazim go by what the practice is. Again, this is a gross oversimplification, but it's true the majority of the time. And something that, so for example, you look at Tosfos versus the Rambam, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about 90% of the time. Okay, let's continue with number 3. there's a concept called ishto kegufa, which means your wife is like you, is like your body. Let's see the context of it here. It doesn't always mean the same thing. Sometimes it means that a husband and wife are so biased in terms of being protective of one another that there's no ne'emanut, there's no, even if we would trust a person's own child to tell us something about their parent, we wouldn't trust one's spouse because they're too close to one another. There may be some also limited applications in nezikin and damages of this principle as well. But let's talk about it in terms of tzniut, in terms of modesty, which is the overarching theme of Chav Daled 24 Brachot, of saying the shema while other members of the family are not fully clothed and one is in bed in the morning or in the evening. What would one, I'm just going to say it's in the morning because of the whole problem with saying the shema. Well, actually, who knows? Okay, that's a whole nother conversation. That's not one of our top 10. So here it says something like this. Gemara says, number 3, that two people who are in bed together, what's the law about them turning away from one another, in other words, facing the other direction, and reciting the Shema? The Gemara says, Shmuel says, yeah, that's, not only is that okay, va'afilu ishto, even if it's the person's wife, imo, meaning the wife is with them in bed, as long as they're not facing one another, even though they didn't have pajamas back then. Maskav Rabbi Yosef asks a question. Ishto b'lomi baracher. You're saying even a wife, and how much more so others? Adarab, on the contrary. I don't know if I'm reading that correctly. Yeah, that's correct. They were correct. Adarab, on the contrary, ishto kegufo, acher lav kegufo. I would say it shouldn't be even your wife. Your wife is not such a big deal because your wife is like your body. Others are not like your body. That would be a bigger deal. That would be a more problematic. What does Rashi say by ishto kegufo? Rashi says, I underlined it here. V'rogel ba v'lekahiru kulei. Why is one's wife like one's body? Because you're accustomed to her and you don't really have thoughts about her. You don't think about her so much in a sexual way. So, that's a problem for marriage. In other words, the Gemara is acknowledging that in the kind of regularity and becoming accustomed to one another, the passion and the desire diminishes. It's almost like Catholics have celibacy and Jews have this concept where when you're married, you're practically celibate because you're not thinking about your wife, because ishto kegufo, because your wife is like you. You're not really passionate. You're not really having thoughts in a sexual way about her. So it's an unfortunate reality that the Gemara is pointing out. But perhaps you could say, well, that's an opinion, meaning does everyone say ishto kegufo? It's in fact a debate. So meaning one opinion says ishto kegufo should be understood in this context, like Rashi, to say a person's sexual interest in their wife is so much diminished because they're married and they're accustomed to one another that it's not a big deal. But you could say that Shmuel says afilu ishto. Shmuel doesn't agree. Shmuel says one is even one's wife, which means a wife is somebody who a husband thinks about lovingly, not just lovingly. Everyone agrees that lovingly is good and okay and regular, but passionately and sexually. So therefore, you could say actually, if ishto kegufo means that a husband is not so passionate about his wife in that type of way, in terms of thinking about her in a sexual way, is actually a machlokis of the Amoraim, and it depends on, pick your opinion and see which one works for you. You could make that a reality one way or another. So I just thought I'd point that out. That was number 3. Number 4 is women in extreme tznius. Let's talk about this, because today you have different communities. You might go into Mea She'arim in a way that you're dressed totally appropriately for Teaneck and feel totally inappropriate in a place like Mea She'arim. Is there any basis for this, or is this just all custom, or is it a custom that's based on some interpretation of the Talmud or Shulchan Aruch? So anyway, let's take a look at this Gemara. The Gemara says, number 4, we're up to number 4, women in extreme tznius and trends in tznius. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. You see where I have number 4? Tefach Beisha erva. Now again, there's context is everything, or not, but let's assume that there's some meaning in context. The context that we're talking about here is reciting the Shema. And the main idea is that you can't recite the Shema under certain circumstances where you have a naked body, either of someone who you can see, or you're at least able to feel or touch or face, and that's the discussion we're having before. Now that's naked. What about if they just have a little bit of skin exposed? And that's what we're going to be talking about here. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Tefach Beisha erva. Before we're talking about somebody who's totally naked. Now we say even a handbreadth of skin in a woman is considered naked in terms of the Shema. Lamai. Now, well, the Gemara actually says, for what? Why are you saying that? For what? What's the point of that statement? Now, are you talking about to not just look at, but to look at with a strong kind of, what's the word? Like an intense gaze. Why, when the Torah talks about the Midianite women's jewelry and garments, does it mention the external jewelry together with the kind of the equivalent of lingerie, and they used to put different jewelry on intimate parts of the body. Lomar lecha kol ha mistakel be'etzba katana shel isha. It teaches us the following lesson. You could look at a woman's pinky, but if you look at it in a very longing, desirous way, ki'ilu mistakel b'makam hatorf. It's like you're looking at their most concealed private parts. Ella. So the Gemara says, in other words, if we're talking about looking at somebody else's wife in an inappropriate way, somebody who you can't be intimate with, and you're staring at any part of them in a way that would arouse desire, then you can't look at anything. You can't look at their, at any part of them. If that's your, it doesn't mean looking at it in a kind of like that you can't see them. It means that you can't stare at it in a longing way. So why do you even need a handbreadth? Rather, the Gemara says we're talking about one's wife, ula kriya shema, and for reciting the Shema. Well, that's kind of a big stretch from going from turning your back on her in bed without any clothes on to saying even if one handbreadth is exposed. Handbreadth where? Her face, her arm, her hand. So obviously most of the commentators say, all the commentators say we're not talking about her face. We're not talking about a part of her body that's normally exposed. We're talking about a normal part of her body that's covered up. And we're talking about Kriya Shema here. Now, Amar Av Chista, okay, so that's one statement. Shok Beisha erva. The thigh of a woman is considered naked. Shenemar Gali Shok Avri Naharot. It's a verse in Isaiah, and it says reveal, reveal your thigh and pass, lift up your skirt so you can walk through the river. And then in the next verse it says, reveal your nakedness, and also let your shame be seen. So we're juxtaposing those two verses to tell you that by picking up your skirt to show some of your leg or upper leg, that's considered erva, that's considered nakedness. Omar Shmuel, Kol Beisha erva. Shmuel goes on to say that a woman's voice, and almost everyone says it's talking about her singing voice, is also considered naked. And again, the context here, according to many of the Rishonim, is only in terms of when you could say the Shema. If a woman is singing, you shouldn't say the Shema then. Like it says in the Song of Songs, because her voice is sweet and beautiful. Amar Rav Sheshas, Sair Beisha erva. Rav Sheshas goes on to say that a woman's hair, it's talking about a married woman, according to almost all the opinions, and it's actually talking about the part of her hair would normally be covered. Not all of her hair. If there's some parts of her hair that would come out, that would be okay if that was the practice then. It's also considered nakedness, again, for the reciting of the Shema. Another verse from the Song of Songs. Okay, let's talk. Fascinating Gemara. So I think they say that the Chazon Ish says, this is the trend, the Mei She'arim trend, that the shok here can't mean the upper leg, because that's like too obvious somehow. I don't know, But he says it's talking about the calf as well, that even the lower part of the woman's leg has to be covered. So part of the reason why you have this extreme tznius that you see in certain places in Brooklyn and in certain places in Israel is based on the Chazon Ish's interpretation of this shok, what the shok means. However, most people learn that the shok is above the knee. It's not below the knee. So again, I don't want to say it's an extreme interpretation, and it's not what the majority of authorities say it is. But okay, it's a minority opinion, and that minority opinion has become the practice in certain places. So again, is it the halacha or a minhag? Those people would argue that it's the halacha because that's how they interpret the halacha. But then again, and even if the majority theoretical opinion is against that opinion, that's the hanhaga of that place. So the question is, do you have to take on the chumrah, so to speak, of a certain place? If you're a visitor, I don't know. If you live there, I don't know. It's a good question. These are interesting issues here. Let's talk a little bit about this idea here of all of this conversation is a machlokas rishonim, whether we're talking about in general or we're talking about only when a person has to recite Shema. In other words, many rishonim learn that this whole section, that everyone who says you can't listen to a woman singing, is basically, that's some opinions say that they extrapolate from this somehow, that because it says the word erva, but in fact, it's really only erva. It's a relative erva. It's erva in terms of that you can't concentrate properly for reciting the Shema. It's not an actual erva. It's not like when a person hears a woman singing. It's like it's like seeing a naked part of them. So that's a machlokas rishonim. Many religious Jews are machmer. They people like the Mishnah Brura, some serious more recent commentators rule stringently, and many of in the Frum community, the Haredi community, definitely accept that ruling. So let's go on to number 5, which is Kol Beisha erva, Sair Beisha erva. Can the famous aruch hashulchan about davening near a woman who has her uncovered hair teach us about women singing in front of men? Let me tell you what I'm talking about here. We just learned this idea of Kol Beisha erva. We said this in machlokas rishonim. It's a debate in the rishonim. It's brought down. The debate is brought down in the Beis Shmuel and Even Ezer, on the Shulchan Aruch, this debate. And in theory, you could say it's still a debate between, let's say, some of the more modern branches of Orthodoxy and some of the more conservative branches of Orthodoxy or right wing. Okay, that's one way of learning it. Another way is saying that it's not so much a question of pure halacha, but it's sociology, which is another fancy word of saying what are people accustomed to, and a little bit of halacha. Let me explain to you what I'm talking about. The aruch hashulchan says that, and I wish I should have looked it up, but I don't have time to look everything up. But I did see him. This is something aruch hashulchan I am familiar with from many years ago, and the aruch hashulchan says that this idea that Sair Beisha erva, which means that the woman's hair is considered an erva for reciting the shema, and I'm assuming similarly for maybe other parts of davening as well, is only in a community where the regulus is for a married woman to cover her hair. If, on the other hand, one person lives, let's say, perhaps there were some communities in, I don't know, Germany, or I don't know where many of the women, even the women who were Shomer Shabbat, did not necessarily cover their hair, the sociological implication would be that it would no longer be considered an erva, and a man could recite the shema even with a married woman's hair uncovered that he could see while reciting the shema. That means that this idea of Sair Beisha erva would be situational. There are Rabbanim today who also paskin like that in terms of kol, in terms of a voice, which they say the idea of Kol Beisha erva, even if you paskin like the stringent Rishonim and Achronim that hold that it's not just for Kriya Shema, but it's in general, that could be if you accepted that as the halacha, but if you're perhaps a Baal Tshuva and you heard women singing growing up, and you're used to it, perhaps in that time, it affected you that you no longer see it as an erva. In other words, certain parts of the body would be considered erva, whether or not the regulus was to cover it or not, meaning if you went to a place where it was clothing optional, so there's no norm of covering anything, that doesn't mean that the naked body in that place becomes non-erva. It's still naked. Naked is naked. But when it comes to the voice and the hair, we could or could not accept the aruch hashulchan's opinion. The Mishnah Berurah does not agree with aruch hashulchan, and obviously many rabbis don't agree that there's a situational heter to allow people to hear women singing if they are Balei Tshuva or modern Orthodox. They consider the stricter opinion non-negotiable. Okay, so that was number 5. Now we go on to number 6, which is another strange story about Rebbi. Rebbi is Rebbi Yehuda HaNasi, the author of the Mishnah. The Gemara says the following: Ani re'isius Rebbi shegia kopiak v'nisatesh v'rok. It's the bottom line here. Rabbi Chanina says, I saw Rebbi that he sneezed, and he burped. Okay. And he yawned. And he he sneezed. Although there's a whole conversation. Nisatish could, sometimes it means sneezing, sometimes it means what's that word when a person flatulates? But here it's going to mean sneezing. Virok, and he spit. These are things we usually don't do during prayer. Umishamish bebigdo. There's a debate between Rashi and Tosfos what that means. I'll go with Rashi. He used his garment to kill a insect that was biting him. Avol lohay misatif. When his talus would fall off during Shemon Esrei, I guess, he wouldn't put it back on. When he would yawn, he'd put his hand over his chin, so you couldn't see him yawning. Okay, so that's the story of Rebbi, and the Gemara is going to ask a question. A lot of those things is considered, at the very least, a balgaiva, disrespectful. You don't yawn. Like if I have an audience with a regular king, I don't yawn in his presence. I don't burp in his presence. I definitely wouldn't flatulate in his presence. So they're at the very least disrespectful, maybe even worse. So how could Rebbi have done them? The Gemara is going to basically say that Rebbi couldn't help himself. In other words, if these are one of the things we often learn from Rebbi is we learn the halacha and then we learn the halacha lemaseh. We learn the halacha is that you can't do certain things as an avel. And then Rebbi goes ahead and does what you're not supposed to do because Rebbi says, "Oh, I'm different. I'm an istinus. I don't have the ability to do those difficult practices." So, in other words, Rebbi had certain leniencies that he had because he was an istinus. That doesn't mean everyone can be an istinus, but that's a whole other conversation. But again, the Gemara will understand that Rebbi did these things not because he felt you could do them lechatchila, which meaning he didn't yawn on purpose, but he yawned almost like because he couldn't help himself. Okay, that's a little bit about the Gemara. Let's go on to number 7. The problem with davening out loud. The Gemara continues and says the following. Mashmiya kol b'tfilos or hareizim b'katnei amana. Somebody who davens Shemon Esrei out loud has little faith. Hamagbiya kolo b'tfilos, somebody who makes his voice even louder when he davens. Hareizim menaviyei hasheker. That person's from the false prophets. Let's talk about this for a moment. Let's first see Rashi. Why menaviyei hasheker? Well, let's first do mikatnei amana. Kilu ena kadosh baruch hu shomei tfilos lachash magbiya harbe. He thinks that God can't hear his prayer unless he says it out loud. So he thinks he's got God is like a person. He's got to hear him speak. And that's you have little faith. I'm going to give over some Ishbitzer Torah. Not that I saw it in the Ishbitzer, but I should have. It's based on his way of thinking. Harizek Mediviyah Sheker. And the next Rashi says, "Why a false prophet?" It says in the story between the face-off and the OK corral between Eliyahu Navi and the prophets of the Baal. It says the prophets of the Baal called out in a great voice. Okay, so, and then the Gemara continues a little further down and says the following: Hamashmiya kolo b'tfilas or is it mikatnei emuna? Amar Rav Hamnunas lo yishanu ela sheyachol lechaven esliba. When do we say this? When you're able to have the right intention, put your heart in the right place. Balachash, when you say it silently. Avol en yachol lechaven esliba balachash. If you can't really have the right intention when you say it quietly, mutter, then it is permitted to say it loud. V'hanimili, but when do we say this? Biyachid, when you're on your own. Avol betzibur, when you're in the community, you're in shul. Asi lemitra tzibur, you're gonna make other people upset, so you have to say it quietly. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this. Both the theoretical issues with saying it out loud and the practical issues of annoying other people, which, by the way, we're going to talk about a difference in halacha of how to actually say Shemon Esrei in Shul. So, let's do first a little bit of Hasidus on this. So there's two different types of practice in halacha. One is you actually have to do an act. The mitzvah requires you to actually pick up a lulav and esrog, right? To pick up the arba minim and shake them. you could whisper you could make the bracha all you want, but if you did not actually pick up the daled minim, you didn't fulfill a mitzvah. The question is, there is this concept about, there's a whole discussion when you recite something like the shema, if hirhur kedibur, if thinking it is like saying it, or do we need to have akimat tzvasav? Do we need to have the lips moving? And even more than lips moving, do we need to have that you hear it with your ears? And all of this has to do with elements of mitzvot that are discussed in different parts of the Talmud. So, for example, we have the concept that Rebbi Akiva says that akimat tzvasav have lemaseh. There's an idea of an act, like when somebody testifies as an aid or aid to sheker, for example, that they actually did action with their speech, right? So there's halachic concepts of speech, about this speech being an action. And for example, in Chassidut, like in the Balatanya, the Alter Rebbe of Chabad, and the Tanya talks about the idea that in the davening, a big part of the davening requires some type of maisa, at least the speaking part of it, because the kavana is certainly very minimal in certain times, and therefore there is an element of maisa ha-mitzvah in reciting of the Kriya Shema that's affected in large part by actually saying the Shema. Here we're not actually talking about the Shema. Here we're talking about the Shemon Esrei, right? So let's talk a little bit about how you say Shemon Esrei. There's a machlokus here between the Kabbalists and the halachic authorities that follow the Kabbalists, and others who might sometimes follow the Kabbalists but don't follow them here. The Ari and the Zohar say that when you're saying the Shemon Esrei, you should not hear it. You should not hear yourself say the Shemon Esrei. That's the practice I follow. There are other authorities that say that you should hear yourself saying the Shemon Esrei, but other people shouldn't hear you. In practice, that's very strange, especially if you're deaf. I heard again in a shir on yu.org that when Rabbi Soloveitchik would say the Shemon Esrei, other people could hear him saying it because he followed the practice that you have to hear yourself say the Shemon Esrei, and he was going deaf, not maybe deaf like all the way deaf, but his hearing wasn't great, and he would say it loud enough for himself to hear it, and so therefore there was always some kind of YU guys, not the regular YU guys, but some like super like nerdy YU guys, that I'd hear them in shul like whispering it super loud. Like I'd be like, what? It's so disturbing. I can't daven Shemon Esrei with this guy in the room. They're like, and I always just thought they were crazy. But then I heard that they're following the custom of Rabbi Soloveitchik. I'm not saying the average YU guy does this, or even if they do it, they don't necessarily do it in the way that, that's super loud that everyone can hear them. But it is actually based on actual machlokus in the Rishonim and the Achronim about about how we daven Shemon Esrei. Okay, so that's one thing. That's hanhagot and so if you go to you could go to 770. And when they're davening Shemon Esrei, it's quiet. You're going to be disturbed by other things there, but you're not going to be disturbed. Nobody's going to whisper really loud during Shemon Esrei. So each community has its own little hanagot that are interesting. And again, I'm not saying the average guy who was a student or a student of Rabbi Soloveitchik is going to be going during Shemon Esrei. But certainly, I have heard a few doing it, and it is kind of annoying. But now, at least I understand it, so I don't find it as an objection. I understand the reason, and therefore I find it less objectionable. It's not a maratzis; it's just a different shita, and based on a hanhaga that might have had somebody who had a little bit of a problem hearing something. But if it's your Rebbi, you want to be exactly like your Rebbi. I understand that. So. Let's talk a little bit about a little deeper the ishbitz. I said I was going to talk about ishbitz, And perhaps what one could say on the Ishbitz level is there's a concept of not forcing. The idea of prayer is that God puts into you where you're holding, like where you should be. He's investing in you the ratzon. You don't know what you really want, in a sense. Meaning sometimes you do, but other times you don't really know what it is, which is your what's your like deepest thing that you need to work on, and who are you? What are you looking to do? And you're asking God to kind of plant it in your heart. So by forcing the prayer, by speaking out loud, you're trying to use a physical thing to kind of like force God's hand or force your own kavanah. There are other parts where you have that type of singing and so on, but not during the Shemona Esrei. The Shemona Esrei is like you're speaking to God, but you're also letting God speak through you, and that's done in silence. So there's a lot more on that, but that's enough for right now. That's number 7. Number 8 is Rav Hamnunas' favorite teaching, and it's okay to have allergies. I kind of like this a little bit, although I've done this a number of times, and I've always never really like understood it, and I think I understand it more now. So Reb Zera says this thing, Ivloi be Rav Hamnuna, v'tiklali kikulu Talmuda. So, I'm not sure whether it's Reb Zera or Rav Hamnuna that is so excited that this teaching is equivalent to the whole of the Talmud that I've studied. It's like my favorite teaching. What's the teaching? Hamisatish b'tfiloso simin yafalo. That if somebody sneezes during their davening, their Shemona Esrei, it's a good sign. What's that? What is the good sign? Kashem she'osin lo nachas ruach melmata, kach osin lo nachas ruach mamayla. Just like you have a nachas ruach, you have a good feeling by sneezing. I guess a relief that you have of something that was bothering you that's released through the sneeze. Also, you're making a nachas ruach. You're making a divine satisfaction. So what is going on here? Why is this Rav Hamnuna's favorite teaching? It's kind of a little bit, to say, oh, I was happy to hear that, fine. But to say that it was his favorite teaching seems slightly strange. So let's see. Let's see what this is. So this is a story that it's really Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera is saying, because of the teaching of Rav Hamnuna, I became very happy. It was equivalent to all the Talmud that I've studied. So why is that? So Reb Zera apparently suffered from some allergies. He would sneeze all the time. I'm assuming it was allergies. I don't know that for a fact. And there were these other opinions that say if you sneeze during prayer, it's really bad. So what did he do? He felt really guilty about it. And then when he heard the teaching of Rabbi Hamnuna that says not only should you not feel guilty, but you should feel blessed by it, that became his favorite Talmud. Okay, wow. What does that mean? That means that there are some like laws or practices that when somebody hears them, it's very depressing for them. It makes them feel really bad. And if they would only know that there's another way of understanding it within the context of the law that allows them to not only feel not guilty, but to feel good about something, that becomes very important to them, which explains why people are always looking for lenient opinions. Therefore, you could say, oh, that's why there's so many, Jewish ways of telling people to relax and take it easy and not have to fear. And that might be true from a psychological perspective. People don't want to feel bad. So by lowering the halachic standards, you have to feel less guilty. But you could also say that there is value within the framework of halacha when you do find a comment that can lift somebody up rather than make them feel bad. Find the one that's positive that will lift them up. And for Reb Zera, that was his favorite teaching. That's a very, very powerful thing. We have to have that in mind when we're educating our children. If there is a way that you can reconcile who they are and what they are. Again, this is something that was involuntary. Somebody sneezes involuntarily. To make them feel bad about it, it doesn't do anything. So when he had the Torah of Rav Hamnunas that made him feel good, that was a welcome relief that he considered his most important teaching. So that's number 8. Now we're up to number 9. There's a fascinating concept of anti-Zionism in the Talmud. You often will see these very religious-looking people who hate the state of Israel. Is there any source for that in the Talmud? And interestingly enough, I'm going to read you some interesting story where it's mostly in Kesuvos, but it's kind of referenced here. The concept is referenced here in number 9. What's the story? Rabbi Abba have a mishtamit minei Rabbi Yehuda. To have a kabbalah lemaseh aradi Yisrael. The rabbi named Abba was avoiding his teacher Rabbi Yehuda because he wanted to go up to live in Israel. Now, what's the problem with that? Why would Rabbi Yehuda have an issue with that? The Amar Rabbi Yehuda kol ha'olam mibavel eretz Yisrael over baseh. Rabbi Yehuda held that if you leave Babylon, to go to Israel, you violate a prohibition, a positive prohibition. What's the positive prohibition? It's in Jeremiah 27. Shenemar bavla yovo v'shama yiu ad yom pakti osam ne'um Hashem. There's a verse that says you're going to go down to Babylon, and there you're going to be until the day that I remember you, I get you. I am God, right? So now, many or most people think it's not even first of all, that's talking about the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian exile between the first and second temple. So we're talking about these rabbis, we're talking about after the destruction of the second temple. So historically speaking, you could say they were already gotten. So it seems ridiculous to keep understanding that for them. But obviously he understood it that since they were no longer with the Beit HaMikdash, that prohibition would come back. There's another way of understanding it that is talking about the Klei HaMikdash. It's talking about the sacred vessels, not talking about the people. And that's how Rabbi Abba understood it. Therefore, he wasn't a problem. But the point is that we see that there were rabbis who understood that when you're in exile in Babylon, even though it wasn't the Babylonian exile, you still should stay in Babylon. I don't know what that would mean in terms of if you're in New York or in California, or is it exclusive to Babel that you can't go up from Babel? Arguably, it's exclusive from Babel. I'm not sure, but the point is that there were rabbis who understood that there's some reason that we need to be in Galut and we have to wait till the right time to go up. So for a more extended conversation, we'll have to do that in Kesuvos, where I'll just tell you one thing. The Rambam does not count living in Israel as a mitzvah, and there's a lot of answers for that, but the Ramban takes great issue with it and brings all these proofs, all these verses that it is a mitzvah to live and inherit the land of Israel. And the Megillas Esther, it's not the book of Esther, it's a commentary that defends the Rambam, has a very unique answer that not everyone agrees with, obviously. There are many other answers, but for the Rambam not counting the mitzvah of living in Israel in the 613 mitzvot. His answer is that there's a rule that the Rambam says that any mitzvah that's not applicable for all time, and all time doesn't mean all the time. Well, I mean, the temple rituals are counted as mitzvot because they are applicable at all time in theory, just in practice they're not. But interestingly enough, the Megillas Esther wants to say that since living in Israel was against the Torah at certain times, based on this understanding of this Rabbi Yehuda and others, I guess, you could arguably say that it's not a mitzvah of all time. Again, I don't understand that, because it's like, it is a mitzvah of all time. There might have been a temporary restriction on it, but perhaps you could argue that it isn't. It's a more in-depth conversation of how to understand the Megillas Esther, but that would explain some of the rationale. If let's say the anti-Zionist Samar Hasidim study the Rambam, study the Megillas Esther, that's not their full rationale behind their anti-Zionism. It's obviously a lot more than that. It has to do with current politics of 100 years ago, nationalism replacing Judaism, irreligious Zionists, and many other factors. But part of it would be this Talmud, mostly the Talmudic Suvas. Part of it would be Maimonides, as interpreted by the Megillas Esther. So just to show you that these people, it's like sociology meets a little tad of a rabbinic source. So just wanted to point that out. It's very interesting, and again, needs to have further explanation. I can't do some very important things in depth in this forum because it's top 10. It's not top 1. Okay, let's continue with number 10, learning and smelly places. The Gemara basically said, it's basically a debate about learning and saying the Shema, and I'm not going to read this inside, but it's on the bottom of, it's a prolonged section right here on Chaf Dalet Amid Beis, and it basically has a debate between two of the rabbis, Rav Hamnunas and Rabbi Chisda, about whether you can study Torah or say the Shema in a place, let's say, that's smelly. I guess people urinated or defecated there. They all agree that you can't sit and study or sit and say the Shema. The debate is only whether you're walking through it. Can you just like cover your mouth, since your mouth is the one that's saying the holy things? Or do you have to stop reciting the Shema or Torah or even thinking Torah in that place? And that's a debate, and I'm going to continue. That debate will spill over onto the top of Chaf Hey Amud Aleph 25a. And I love the source of the debate in terms of how to understand different verses. And we'll do that. Hopefully that'll be number 1 of the top 10 for 25. So to be continued in a way. Thank you for watching.